Hello and welcome back to my channel. And today a bit of a discussion topic for you. Has art ever really represented the society it comes from? Now, I was led to this discussion through this Blu-ray package that I got last year, Michael Powell Early Works. Michael Powell was a famous British film director in the 30s, 40s and 50s. But he had to serve an apprenticeship, right? And what he did was, in the 1930s, a law was passed by the British government that so many of the films showing at British cinemas had to be British made, right? And this meant that companies started making what were called quota quickies. They started flooding the British market with cheap B features, which were support features for other movies. And that's how Michael Powell cut his teeth as a director. He made loads of them, absolutely loads of them. 13 of them have survived, and 5 of them have been restored for this fantastic box set. And they look pristine. They look like they were made yesterday. And I bought them partly as an interest in Michael Powell, but also because it was an insight into British cinema of the 1930s, and as I thought, British culture of the 1930s. And I really enjoyed watching them. But I was reading the booklet about them, and I was caught short because there was a quote from Michael Powell himself about one of the films. He said, "It's another polite drama about non-existent people." In other words, this film that he was making was a sort of murder mystery thriller set amongst an upper middle class dinner party, and he says these people don't exist. They're just a creation, an artistic creation, a pop culture creation, but they have no reality. So there we are, here we are in 2025, we're watching these films from the 1930s, seeing them as part of British film culture, but even the people making them at the time don't think they represent their society, the world they're living in, at all. And I have often felt this way. At university, when I was studying literature and when I was studying film, I was repeatedly told this mantra, which apparently is self-evidently true, that all art represents the society it comes from. But does it? Does it really? Let me ask you a question. How many British films have you seen that you think really represent the Britain that you live in? I don't think I could name one. There are many British films that I admire and I love, but that show the reality of the Britain that I live in, the Britain that people live in every day to day. Think about it now. Could you name a film or a TV series that really actually mirrors the world you live in? It might show themes and things that are taking place in your society, but does it show the reality that you're living day to day? Of course, what became clear as I went through university was that the reason why, and it was principally the left brought this idea in to cultural studies and art studies, was because once you say that art is a product of society rather than an individual, this is where this whole idea of the death of an author, which you might have heard of, comes from, then you can deconstruct it. And you can deconstruct it looking at how society and the politics of that society works. When you're saying that this is the intention of an artist or of an individual, you look at the art purely in terms of that artist's interests and their themes and their ideas. But if you say, well, actually, that artist isn't that important, they are a product of their society, so what they're producing is a product of their society, therefore we can deconstruct this artwork politically, socially, culturally, right? Now, I was one of those irritating people at university who didn't quite accept what these lecturers were telling me. I was a bit of a wanker, you know. And when I was studying film, an essay I wrote on this subject was, I went to Time Out magazine, which at that time was the listings magazine for London. So it told you what was all on all the theatres, all the art galleries, all the cinemas. And I listed every single film that was currently showing at the cinema. And I said, what does this tell us about society right now, 1999? These are all different films. There's horror films, there's romantic films, romantic comedies. There's films from Iran, there's films from China, there's films from America. What can we really say about this? It's a nonsense. We could just cherry pick one, 2, 3 films, draw a line between them according to our own political and ideological bias, and say, this is what it tells us. This stuff is highly respected. There's a very good American critic called Jim Hoberman, and he did it in decades through American history, cinema of the 50s, cinema of the 60s, cinema of the 70s, reading American history through its cinema. But that's just his point of view on American history. He's just saying what he wants to say about American history and finding the examples in cinema to back it up. But what about all those other hundreds of examples? Was he talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre when he was talking about 70s US cinema? Or was he talking about all those conspiracy theory dramas? I wonder. You can make all sorts of arguments about current society. Could you say, really, that the 1990s in Britain could be represented by the films of Richard Curtis and Nick Hornby? Does that really show what Britain was like in the 1990s? You see, that's the problem. Then there are other sort of more literal problems with this. What about when films come out? We all know about the distribution problems of films. Some films don't get distributed until 2 years after they're made. Right now, at this moment, as I'm making this video, I'm on tenterhooks to see the latest film by David Cronenberg. It's called The Shrouds. It was premiered at Cannes last year. It still hasn't got a UK release, right? And I don't know when it's going to get a UK release. This is a major director. It's been an extraordinarily famous and important and influential director for the last 40 years. Yet his latest film has not got a release. What does that say about our society? Does our society not want it? Does it even know about it? Is it just because of money, because the distributors don't think it's going to make any cash? So how can that feed into any kind of cultural history? Do you see what I mean? There's a problem here. Cultural history is a decision. It's not like we look at historical artifacts and make deductions from those. We're actually reading in our own ideas. Let me take another example. How we look and evaluate the history from other epochs. Now let me give an example of this. If I was to ask you the question, who was the most well-read and popular Victorian poet in that late 1800s era? Robert Browning? Elizabeth Barrett Browning? Christina Rossetti? Tennyson? No, it was Martin Tupper. Tupper. You've heard of Tupper, right? Well, no, maybe you haven't. The reason is because he's not been in print for over 100 years. You can actually get his anthology if you order it by demand, but it's not been in public demand for 100 years, and this was the most widely read and widely sold poet in Victorian England. His story is mentioned in this book, Banvard's Folly. I really recommend this. It's a series of profiles of 13 people throughout history who in their era, they were scientists, writers, artists, musicians, were incredibly famous and popular. They were household names and now are totally forgotten by history. The title of the book is taken from John Banvard. John Banvard was an American painter, and around about 1850, halfway through the 19th century, he was the most famous and admired painter in the West. Right? He made these kind of dioramas, and they were incredibly highly valued, so much so that he was a rare painter who was extremely rich. He built this gigantic house out in the middle of nowhere, right? But because of the nature of his paintings, they were dioramas rather than paintings you can hang in a gallery. Most of them were destroyed over the years, and he's been completely forgotten. Now, there's two instances there of artists who've been forgotten by history, but at the time they were significant. Other artists have been forgotten by history because we don't like what they did. It doesn't accord with our moral values and our way of seeing the world and our philosophy, so we dismiss it. So what we're saying here is we are representing that society according to our values and our intellectual criteria and touchstones, not according to the touchstones of that era. When it comes to art, I often go back to this book, Kenneth Clark's Civilization. Kenneth Clark was the head of the National Gallery in the mid-20th century, and he made a famous TV series with the BBC, The History of Western Art. It was called Civilization. And in the very first episode, he starts by quoting the famous art critic from the 19th century, Ruskin. And this is what he says. Ruskin said, "Great nations write their autobiographies in 3 manuscripts, the book of their deeds, the book of their words, and the book of their art. Not one of these books can be understood unless we read the 2 others. But of the 3, the only trustworthy one is the last." And he goes on to say, "On the whole, I think this is true. Writers and politicians may come out with all sorts of edifying sentiments, but they are what is known as declarations of intent. If I had to say which was telling the truth about society, a speech by a Minister of Housing, or the actual buildings put up in his time, I should believe the buildings. Now, for the longest time, I kind of agreed with Kenneth Clarke because I was a big art lover and I wanted to believe that art had more validity to it than politics and, political actions and writing. But I started to doubt it. After all, art throughout time has idealised, hasn't it? I mean, for example, the portrait paintings of kings and monarchs were deliberately idealised not to show any ugliness or any sort of deformities in their face. We know that, for example, the female form, the female body, for years was idealised. They wouldn't paint pubic hair. There is this kind of rather malicious apocryphal story about Ruskin that on his wedding night he discovered his wife had pubic hair and he was appalled. I think that's an apocryphal story, but it's amusing because it gets to the heart of this kind of idealisation of art. When we look at Egyptian hieroglyphics, are we really seeing Egyptian society as it was? These were friezes or hieroglyphics of people in their tombs. I mean, if you walk around a cemetery now in your local area, does that cemetery really tell you about the society of the people? There's some social history there. People when they were born, when they died, what they did for a living. But do all the statues and all the carvings, does that give you an idea of how people thought? Or is it an idealisation? We come forward in time. Impressionism. Is Impressionism an idealised idea of art? It's certainly a stylised idea of art. It's not a photographic, realistic image of the way that France looked at the time, but an image that is wholly subjective, wholly personal. And our own take on art is personal. Recently, I was struck. I was doing proofreading a translation on a documentary. And it was a documentary about an exhibition that's currently showing in Lyon, in this museum in Lyon, of a modernist painter. And this painter had taken several self-portraits of himself that were heavily stylised, where he was upside down. And the person doing the documentary said that this repudiates the whole history of art in the Western world and its idealisation of the body. I was thinking, really? What about Rembrandt's self-portraits that show him the reality of him aging? What about Lucian Freud? What about Egon Schiele? What about Francis Bacon? But anyway, the point is made that she claimed that this was a sort of riposte to this idealisation. So there you have it. Have we even seen the human body represented properly? The core of all societies. And if we are represented by the art contemporary to our situation, then that means that our generation, our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, has been represented by the modern art that's appeared since the start of the 20th century. Mostly abstract, mostly quite niche, mostly the art of an artistic elite that is not something, a common language, let's say, amongst the vast majority of people. Does that represent what the 20th century was like? How most people felt? How most people looked? I don't really think so. Let's move to television and popular media. Now, Orwell, in his essay looking back at the Spanish Civil War, which of course he fought in, one of the things that Orwell worried about, and this would later inform 1984, he was worried that when he was fighting in Spain, that he'd come back to England, he'd read newspapers and he'd read about battles that never happened. He'd read about people who were supposed to have been, great warriors in this conflict, who were never actually there. He knew from his own personal experience that the media was reporting events either in an extremely distorted form or which never happened at all. And what worried him about that was it was not just an issue of the media and of popular political opinion. It was also a matter of history, because what happens in those newspapers goes down in the history books. If you're talking about a cultural historian now, looking back at the history of the 1936-1939 Spanish War, where do they go to? Primary sources, newspapers, journalistic accounts. But what if they're false? Now, let me give an example of how this is important in the modern day, both in terms of news and in terms of television drama. I remember back in 2010, the general election in Britain, and it was the first time in Britain we'd had a presidential style, US style debate, where all the leaders standing for the election had a debate in a studio. It was a big deal. My family were on holiday in Cornwall at the time, and we should have been enjoying ourselves, but my dad was a big politics buff, and he says, we've got to watch this, it's a landmark moment. So we sat down as a family to watch it, right? And it was the most boring hour of my life. It was so tedious. My dad, who was hugely into politics, actually fell asleep, right? So we thought it was a complete dud. It was really boring, no one stood out, it wasn't very interesting. 5 minutes later, the news at 10 on ITV, and the headline is, Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrats smashes David Cameron and Gordon Brown. He absolutely aces it, and everyone's behind Nick Clegg now. And I sat there, my family sat there and thought, well, that's not what we saw. But that's what's gone down in history as what happened at the 2010 general election, that Nick Clegg of the Lib Dems aced the first debate and then set the tone for the rest of that election campaign. I've seen that myself in living history. Now let's move forward to a more contemporary situation in drama. You can't have failed to have heard, if you're in Britain, of the series Adolescence. Now, this is a programme I have not seen. It's a Netflix drama, I don't have Netflix, but everyone's been talking about it, you can't avoid it. It's about a young boy who starts doing sort of what you might call toxic masculine acts. And it's been seen as a major breakthrough drama in showing a difficult subject, something that's current in Britain, and it's actually being shown in schools. But there is a counterblast against this from people who say, this is incredible that here is a white working class boy who's shown as being horrible. And there's been a complete media ignorance of the whole grooming gang scandal, which involves different ethnicities and possibly racist motives. That hasn't been covered in the drama, but this has. It's okay to demonise a white working class kid, but it's not okay to demonise this group or minority group. Now, I don't want to get into that because I haven't seen the drama, so I don't really have an opinion. But what's interesting to me about it is that it's a drama that has provoked two very, very different responses. Two very different social, cultural and political responses. So which one represents us? Who's making that drama and for whom? And if they have the power to make their drama and show it to their audience, does that then become our cultural history? But what about all the people who don't agree with it? What about all the people who don't feel represented by it or attacked by it? Which goes into history? Which does the cultural historian take as their vehicle for, in the future, in 50 years' time, what will this era be represented by? Will it be represented by adolescents? Will people say, oh, this is what those people cared about. This is what those people wanted to watch. You see the difficulty. To give a more trivial example, I was at work, a few years ago in the office, and all the younger people in the office were saying, oh, it's going to be, Batman versus Superman's coming to the cinema. I think it had Ben Affleck in it, right? And they were all saying the same thing. They were all saying, it's going to be shit. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be absolute rubbish. I hate Ben Affleck. They all went to see it. They all came back to the office and said it was crap. So they all spent money. The cultural historian will say, this was an extremely popular film. Loads of people went to see it. Therefore, I can discuss it as a cultural item that's germane to producing a portrait of that era. Yet every single person thought it was going to be rubbish, said that it was rubbish, and hated it. And now the film's virtually forgotten. So who's right? Who gets to represent society? Another interesting example of this for me is one of my own subscribers is a guy called Nikolai from Denmark. He calls himself the Film Classic. Very good site if you've not visited it. And what interests me about Nikolai is he's in his 20s, but he clearly prefers classic films, like classic Hollywood films, films from the 40s, 50s, 60s, rather than stuff now. He's just done a whole series of videos looking at favourite films from each decade. And in the last couple of videos, he's had to say, well, I don't really like stuff from now. So where does that leave us? Here's a young guy who is not relating to the art of his time, so it's clearly not representing him. He feels more represented by the stuff from the past. How does that fall into cultural historians, idea of what's happening? Ultimately, what I would say is, all art is an illusion. All narrative is a fiction. We are put in a special space set apart from reality. So it's already an idealised space. And that's necessary because it allows us to pose situations or ask questions that we couldn't necessarily ask in real life. So we're already at one remove, at arm's length from reality. What I would also say that we've got to consider here is that art is all about showing the idealised version of ourselves. The upper classes and middle classes who've controlled art through most of its history have a vested interest in using it to idealise their position, or, if they want to look at what's bad in society, to show society at its absolute worst. In either case, we're not seeing society as it is. We're not representing reality. We're taking reality, taking a chunk of reality, putting it to one side, shaving off all the difficult bits to get to the stuff we want to say, the story we want to say. I can't help feeling that this whole idea that art necessarily represents society is actually an intellectual conceit that willfully ignores so many other variables. It makes a simple equation: art equals society, society equals art. And every other aspect, personal intention, both of the artist and of the consumer. Things, financial matters like when the piece of art becomes available. Does it become available posthumously after a writer has died, for example? All of these other variables are thought of to be of no account and no interest. And I just can't accept that. I'm interested to know what you think about this. Does it worry you? Is it of no importance to you? Or are there other elements of it that you've come across that concern you? Just to get a bit of a discussion going. Thanks very much.